Hi, I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a reenactor. For 36 years, I used my hobby of historical reenactment to try to bring the subject of world history to life for my students. And I'd dress for the time period, and I'd bring in stuff for my students to handle, to make it more real, and try to immerse them in the culture. Well, I'm not in the classroom anymore, and I've got to put all this garb to use, plus my passion for bringing the past to life and playing history detective. And what I decided to do once I got out of the classroom was I took a deep dive into California history, and while researching the missions, I ended up coming across references to saloons in the desecularized missions, and that there were certain famous outlaws that apparently used to hang out in these saloons. So I've been chasing Bandidos for a bit, and I started covering the Dalton Gang because I'd run into a reference to them around Mission San Miguel. And in the previous video, we just saw the Daltons commit their first train robbery, which wasn't successful. It was an attempted train robbery. But it's going to result in 2 of the brothers on the run and 2 of the brothers in jail. And that's where the story picks up. I hope you stick with me. After the robbery, or attempted robbery, of the train at Alila, Bob and Emmett hide out in the mountains near Brother Bill's place. And then they cross the Tehachapis and they cross the Mojave Desert, and Bill basically takes a train and he's kind of laying out supplies along the way for them. And they nearly die during that trip. Well, then they move on into Utah and go to a couple of places there. They're being pursued by Sheriff K, of Tulare County. And they go into Arizona, they go into New Mexico, then they actually go into Mexico, and then they double back and they are in Kansas around their mom's place, and then they go someplace else, and each time what ends up happening, it's like something out of The Fugitive. As far as Sheriff K shows up and he's just missed the Daltons. And this goes on for like months, and then finally he just has to get back to Tulare County, to Visalia, because he wants to be there for the trial of Grat. Well, what ends up happening with Grat and Bill, because Bill was also locked up, Bill ended up getting released, and now Bill turns around and he sells off most of his animals, most of his stock, and he is working on trying to get the best defense for Grat possible. So he ends up hiring an attorney named Beckenridge. He doesn't know that Beckenridge also works for Southern Pacific. And so what Beckenridge does is he basically puts up a really shoddy defense, to the point where people are looking around going, what's going on here? And he throws Grat under the bus. Well, maybe more properly under the stage or under the train, if you want to go for the time period. And Grat is going to be, detained, and they're looking at giving him 20 years, but the sentencing hasn't come quite yet. On September 3rd, 1891, a train robbery occurred outside of Ceres, basically near Modesto, and immediately the Daltons are suspected. Well, Grat couldn't have done it. He's still sitting in the jail in Visalia. But it was assumed Bob and Emmett were around and that they were going to try to bust Grat out of jail. And the railroad also suspected that Bill Dalton was involved. Sheriff K had a different idea. He had a few suspects he was going to question in Visalia because he was looking at the evidence of a coat that was found that was made by a tailor in Visalia. But the railroad told Kay, no, you go look for the Daltons. Well, he checked his Visalia suspects first, and those did not pan out. They had alibis. And then he got a tip from one of his deputies. He said there were a couple of men skulking around an abandoned stagecoach stop. Sheriff Kay assumed, oh, that's got to be Bob and Emmett. Turned out to be Bill. And Bill was hiding somebody else who was in trouble with the law. So the two of them get arrested and thrown in the Visalia jail. Grat's still there, by the way. And the charges end up getting dropped about the Ceres robbery, but Bill is still being held as an accessory to the Alila robbery. Now, after the Ceres robbery, Grat knows his sentencing is coming up. He's looking at probably 20 years in San Quentin. And what he ends up doing, he ends up escaping. And the way he does it, a lot of people think that it was his friend Chris Evans who ended up slipping him a wrench, which proved to be useless, a saw, a file, a whetstone, I guess to keep everything sharp. And he gets the other inmates, including the Tulare twins, who are totally hero worshiping Grant, or Grat. They're in total fanboy mode. And he gets people to make noise. So whenever he or these other two inmates he's planning to escape with are sawing or making any kind of noise, these guys are making a big show of playing cards and being real loud. They're singing real loud. And what ends up happening is, okay, Grat finally escapes with the other two guys. And, the jailer doesn't know it for like about 12 hours, which is kind of bad. And now they're looking like, okay, where is this guy? And they move Bill, who was locked up after the Ceres thing. He's locked up, and he's in a cell upstairs in this two-story structure, and that cell is basically set aside for people that are insane. They move him down to Grat's cell, and Bill's got a guitar, and he's singing a song that he's basically popular tune, but he's written his own words of "You'll never miss my brother until he's gone." And eventually, like, the hole is discovered, the missing bar is discovered. They find that there's a broomstick that was blackened with soot that was put in place of where a bar was removed. So what ends up happening now is Grat is on the run. He's gone. And, he's going to join his brothers back in Kansas. Bill will eventually get released. Charges are going to be dropped. And he ends up getting rid of his farm. And he gets his wife and family up to his wife's folks' place. And he goes to Kansas with his brothers. After successful train robberies, officials of the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad offered a reward of $40,000 for anyone who could capture and convict the Dalton Gang, and a reward of $5,000 for the arrest of any of them. Bob Dalton had ambitions. He claimed, beat anything Jesse James ever did, rob two banks at once in broad daylight. On October 5th, 1892, the Dalton Gang attempted to do just that. They set out to rob the CM Condon and Company's Bank, and the First National Bank on opposite sides of the street in Coffeyville, Kansas, where they had grown up. Bob had planned the entire robbery. Emmett, however, was against the idea because he'd gone to school near Coffeyville, knew hundreds of people in town, and was afraid some of his friends would be hurt. But Bob assured him there would not be any shooting and that it would be all over before anyone knew what happened. The plan was that Bob and Emmett were to rob the First National Bank while Gratt, Broadwell, and Powers, two other members of the gang, robbed the Condon Bank across the street. Of course, they were noticed before the robberies began. Gratt was shot in the throat, Bob was hit in the head and the heart, killing him instantly, and so were Broadwell and Powers. Emmett was able to mount his horse unwounded and began riding away. But when he saw Bob was hit, he turned around and tried to lift his brother onto his horse. Emmett was then hit in the back with a load of buckshot. He actually had 23 wounds, survived, and was given a life sentence in the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas, of which he served 14 years before being pardoned. He moved to Hollywood and became a real estate agent, an author, and an actor, and died in 1937 at age 66. Bill Dalton and Bill Doolin had been waiting several miles away with extra horses to aid the gang's escape. After getting tired of waiting, they left, only to learn the fate of the gang. After Bob and Gratt were killed at Coffeyville, Bill Dalton formed another gang with Bill Doolin, known as the Wild Bunch, or the Dalton-Doolin Gang. Not the same as the movie. After Bill Dalton went off on his own, and while hiding out with another outlaw named Richard Little Dick West, he was gunned down by a deputy in 1895. Bill would form his own gang and meet his end a year earlier in 1894 in Elk Indian Territory, shot down by a deputy. Well, that's it for the Dalton Gang, or the Dalton Brothers. And there's a couple of sources from family members. Emmett wrote a book. Remember, he's the one who survived and went to prison. Also, the brother Littleton, he wrote his own book, because he was looking at it from, in a way, the outside. He was one of the non-criminal Daltons, so you can check those out. Anyway, I'm on to another adventure, and I'm going to track down the Tulare twins. I hope you stick with me on my journey.